Well, here we are again, and I'm glad everybody out there is joining us, possibly. If not, kid, you're looking at Papa again, and I'm glad that this is something that I can do for you. And hopefully for my great-grandchildren, your children, that you'll pass this truth on to them, because at this point in time, you're not going to hear it anywhere else. So with that, let's get into chapter 29 of what? The Chaplains and Clergy of the Revolution, that was compiled and published by J.T. Headley in 1864. Okay, so this chapter is 29 and it's David Avery. And here's what we're going to try and learn inside this chapter. His birth and character, converted under Whitfield, who we talked about many chapters ago, and a little bit about his tomb, leaves his trade to study for the ministry, enter Dr. Wheelock's charity school, graduates at Yale College, studies divinity, a missionary among the Indians, settled at Gaysboro, Vermont, his patriotism, raises a company and marches to Boston, made chaplain, Noodle's Island, he was present at the Battle of Bunker Hill, praying for victory, accompanies Washington through the Jerseys, wounded at Trenton, at Valley Forge, at Ticonderoga, at Bennington, and then his death. Now, I don't know that he was wounded at all of those places, but he was for sure wounded at Trenton, but he was at all of those other battles. So this guy was at some of the most major and significant battles of the Revolution War. Wow. I'm looking forward to this one. Are you ready? Here we go. About David Avery. Mr. Avery was born in that part of Norwich, Connecticut, now called Franklin, in April 5th, 1746. His parents, John and Lydia Smith Avery, were blessed with a large family of children, though possessing but limited means to provide for their education. Hence David was apprenticed at an early age to a house joiner in his native town. Gentle and kind in his manners, and with a heart full of tenderness, he had at the same time a bold and fearless nature which, when roused, it was dangerous to oppose. Soon after he commenced his apprenticeship, he heard the celebrated Whitfield preach, who was then electrifying the country with his eloquence and stirring the hearts of men by his solemn appeals and overwhelming application of divine truth to the conscience. Young Avery went at first from curiosity to hear one so distinguished for his eloquence, but soon became deeply impressed with the truths he uttered, and eventually embraced religion. Ardent and resolute in everything he undertook, he wished to devote his life to the services of his master in a more direct and efficient manner than he thought he should be able to do by pursuing his trade. And he resolved, if he could obtain the means, to educate himself to become a minister of the gospel. Applying to his parents for aid, he was met with the disheartening answer that it was out of their power to help him. Then he turned to his elder brother and begged him to loan him the necessary money to make a beginning, but was again disappointed. Thrown back upon his own resources, he nevertheless did not despair, but went resolutely to work at his trade till he obtained money sufficient to buy himself a stock of clothing, and then entered Dr. Eliezer Wheelock's Indian Charity School, situated in that part of Lebanon known as Hebron. Applying himself energetically to the task of fitting himself for college, he made the rapid advancement which young men of intellect invariably do who feel that they are to be artifices of their own fortune. It was here that he became familiar with the Indian character, a knowledge that fitted him so admirably to act as he afterward did as a missionary to the Indians of central New York. He paid his expenses by spending a portion of the year in teaching the Indians the rudiments of an English education. While at Dr. Wheelock's, the he made the acquaintance of the notorious Brant, of whom he afterwards was accustomed to speak as a lad of keen intellectual powers and well fitted to rule the Indians. And if you remember, we talked about Brant before in a few chapters back, and where people thought that he would be, someone that would come to the side of the colonies, rejected that and sided with the British, which caused all of those terrible Indian wars in central New York like that, which we've talked about in other chapters. So, continuing. At that time, however, he said he gave no indications of the cruelty that subsequently disfigured his character, talking about Brant. After remaining at Dr. Wheelock's 2 years, he entered the freshman class of Yale College. This was in 1765. In the same class were the afterwards celebrated Timothy Dwight and Dr. Strong of Hartford. And we talked about Dr. Dwight earlier as well, both of whom became chaplains in the Army. Noted for his studious habits, he passed successfully through the first 2 years of his college life. A portion of his junior year was spent among the Six Nations as a missionary. He stood high in the estimation of all who knew him, and when he graduated, received with his baccalaureate an honorary degree from Dartmouth. Wow, both. Ooh, that's pretty good. After finishing his collegiate course, he entered on the studies of divinity at Dr. Wheelock of Hanover, New Hampshire. So here he got his bachelor's degree from Yale, but in addition to that, he got an honorary degree from Dartmouth. Pretty interesting. Receiving his ordination in 1773, he spent a year or more with Dr. Kirkland among the Oneida Indians. Leaving here, he went to Long Island, where he preached with much success. In his diary kept at this time, he says, quote, preached at Sag Harbor a New Year's sermon. People solemn. I desire to begin the year with God. Lord, let me spend at and be spent for thee. Dispose of me as thou pleasest. Send me where thou pleasest. Let me have no will of my own, or let my will be thine. End quote. He afterwards removed to Gaysboro, Vermont, where he was selected at the breaking out of the Revolution. When the news of the Battle of Lexington reached this quiet place, the inhabitants were filled with the most intense excitement. To the noble-souled pastor, however, it came like a trumpet call to the soldier in the battle. He saw at once that the hour big with fate to the colonies had come, and kindling with the lofty patriotism that filled the hearts of so many, as the tidings of the first fierce conflict was borne with the tap of the drum by swift riders to the remotest limits of the colonies, he at once decided to do what lay in his power to help on the glorious cause of liberty. The next Sabbath, to the astonishment of his congregation, he preached his farewell sermon, telling them that God would take care of them. As for himself, he was going to join the army. It was a solemn day to all. And when the services were closed, each turned away, filled with new thoughts, new fears, and new hopes. But the impressive scene was not yet over. The patriotic pastor had no intention of going alone to the army. He knew that besides encouragement in the day of trial and ministrations to the sick, the wounded, and the dying, it needed stout arms and good muskets for the day of battle. So after the congregation was dismissed, he stood on the steps of the church and summoned them to listen to another address. He had performed the duties of the sanctuary, and he now wished to perform those of a patriot. Oh my. I just always pray that we would see pastors like this again to stand up against the evils and the battles that we're fighting in America. Excuse me. Now continuing. He spoke of the contest that had begun, of the righteousness of their cause, and the pressing need of soldiers if they would maintain their rights. He said it was God's cause, and haranguing them like a prophet of old, summoning the children of Israel to battle, he earnestly besought them to lay off at once the trappings of husbandry and, leaving their untilled fields, gird on the weapons of war and become reapers of men. Then their bleeding country, he said, called on them in pleading assents, and he entreated them by every motive of patriotism, and as they valued liberty and abhorred slavery, not to turn a deaf ear to her cry. It was a noble, soul-stirring spectacle, that earnest servant of God calling on his parishioners to leave wives and children and parents and follow him to the field of battle. His burning words fell on hearts already on fire with patriotism, and that quiet Sabbath day among the hills became a scene of thrilling excitement. 20 of his parishioners responded to his call, and shouldering their muskets started on foot with him for Boston. They chose him captain, and marching rapidly forward, reached Northampton Saturday night. The rumor of his coming soon spread through the town, and next day a large congregation assembled to hear him preach. One would give a good deal at this day to possess that sermon. His patriotic fervor was so contagious that volunteers came eagerly forward and enrolled themselves in his little company. In the meantime, the clergymen in the vicinity of his parish, sympathizing deeply with him in his devotion to his country, met together and agreed to supply his pulpit while he was absent. The little band kept on their way, and on Saturday, the 29th of April, arrived in camp at Cambridge. The troops assembled to receive the Reverend Captain and his men, as they were called, for the spirited example encouraged the hearts of all. The next day, being the Sabbath, a temporary stage was erected in the area of Cambridge College by turning up a rum hogshead, from which Reverend Dr. Langdon, president of Harvard College, preached a sermon from 1 Timothy verse 12, or 1 Timothy, chapter 6, 12. Quote, "Fight the good fight of faith," end quote. In the afternoon, Mr. Avery preached from Nehemiah 4:14, quoting, "And I looked, and rose up, and said unto the nobles and rulers, and to the rest of the people, Be not ye afraid. Remember the Lord, which is great and terrible, and fight for your brethren, your sons and your daughters, your wives, and your homes." End quote. I want to give commentary here but I would probably jump into a sermon myself. So I think we'll just continue reading on because, Papa would take off on some different things. But anyway, let's continue with the story of Mr. Avery. With such kind of men and such kind of appeals was the cause of freedom upheld and borne onward. And yet, this conduct of Mr. Avery in collecting and leading on troops in person and of others like him passes unnoticed or is merely alluded to incidentally, while the action of town committees and the adoption of patriotic resolutions by civilians receive the most earnest consideration. Quote, these things ought ye to have done, and not left the other undone. End quote. I do have to make a comment here for everybody that's watching, as well as you kids, is that as Mr. Avery began in the beginning of the book, um, it was just so commonplace with these pastors to be so patriotic and so involved in doing what was right that they didn't receive a lot of credit for it. So that's why, the historians in especially the 21st century just put it all like, yeah, right, those Christians didn't do nothing. This isn't a Christian nation, whereas that's a lie. And we have to hold to these truths that pastors should be involved in every aspect of bringing a moral people to such a place that even they should stand on the church steps and decry the things of infanticide, of all of the evils and political unrighteousness that comes from humanism and all the other isms. All right, enough of that. Continuing. Mr. Avery, soon after his arrival at headquarters, was assigned to Colonel Sherburne's regiment, in which he instituted a regular course of daily religious services. Besides the performance of these public duties, he used to go from tent to tent and read the Word of God, talk with the farmer soldiers, listen to their tales of distress, and relieve them whenever in his power. The camp and bustle of war were strange to these men. They had come from quiet homes in the valleys and on the hillsides, and from the family altar and the house of God. And the presence of such a minister was a comfort and a blessing that at this day we cannot appreciate. He prayed with them and helped the youthful to overcome the temptation that always surrounded the soldier, and boldly rebuked sin, and strove in every way to make the camp a camp of the Lord, like the tents of Israel, over which God's blessings should hover. He does not tire of his arduous work, but writes home that he is glad that he has espoused the cause of his country. In his diary, he makes the following entry, quote, May 11th, a provincial fast, preached on Cambridge Common. The troops appeared quite serious. May 29th, went on a volunteer expedition to Noddle Island. A brisk skirmish, some of our men killed. Stood guard 2 hours that night after praying and exhorting with the expedition. End quote. This brief note is all that he gives us to show what part he took in it. Noodles Island, near Boston, and Hog Island were covered with hay and cattle, sheep and horses, and the Americans wished to prevent them from falling into the hands of the enemy. So about 11 o'clock in the forenoon on the 27th, a party of 20 or 30 men passed from Chelsea to Hog Island and thence to Noddle Island and commenced driving off the cattle. The British, observing it, sent a schooner and sloop with a party of marines and boats to capture them. The Americans, seeing them approach and finding that they had not time to drive off all the stock, commenced shooting them and thus destroyed great numbers. As the hostile vessel drew near, they reached to Hog Island and cleared it of between 300 and 400 sheep and a large number of cows and horses. They then drew up on Chelsea Neck to receive the enemy. In the meantime, the American officers at Cambridge had called for volunteers to reinforce the gallant little band that had done so nobly and now stood at bay. Avery, with the brave Warren, was among the volunteers. Putnam took command of the detachment and, hurrying forward with 2 4-pounders, reached the threatened point at 9 o'clock in the evening. A brisk fire was immediately opened on the vessel, which was kept up till 11, when the crew of the schooner, finding it too hot, abandoned the contest. The firing then ceased, and it was thought advisable to make no further movement till daylight should reveal the position of the enemy. Avery took advantage of the cessation of the conflict to exhort the little group of patriots and pray with them. He then shouldered his musket and kept watch for 2 hours. At daybreak, they boarded the schooner, and carrying off 4 4-pounders and 12 swivels, set her on fire. In this skirmish, the English lost 25 in killed and wounded, while the Americans had only 4 wounded, and those slightly. In the Battle of Bunker Hill, as it is called, but which it is well known to have taken place on Breed's Hill, this brave, godly man stood on Bunker Hill in full sight of the conflict, and as Moses, who stood on the hill and held up his hands that Joshua might smite the Amalekites, so he, while the adjacent heights and shores were shaking to the thunder of cannon, and the flames of burning Charlestown were rolling heavenward, lifted up his hands and prayed that God would give victory to the Americans. Breed's Hill, dimly seen through the rolling smoke of battle, amid which flashed the deadly volleys and gleamed the glittering lines, and in the background this patriotic divine, with upraised hands, beseeching heaven for victory, would make an appropriate picture of that bloody prelude to the Revolution. He thus notes the event in his diary, quote, "Early in the morning of June 18th, the enemy attacked our entrenchments, but was driven back. After repeated trials, they succeeded in dislodging the troops. In the retreat, many of Colonel Sherborne's men were killed. My dear friend, Dr. Warren, was shot dead." I have to stop there because Dr. Warren was a very good friend of Samuel Adams as well. Okay. Continuing. I stood on a neighboring hill, bunker, with hands uplifted, supplicating the blessings of heaven to crown our unworthy arms with success. To us, infantile Americans, unused to the thunder and carnage of battle, the flames of Charleston before our eyes, the incessant play of cannon from their shipping, from Boston, and their wings in various cross directions, together with the fire of musketry from more than 4 times our number, all heightened the majestic terrors of the field, exhibiting a scene most awful and tremendous. But amid the perils of the dread encounter, the Lord was our rock and fortress. End quote. Quote, the enemy burned Charlestown that they might be benefited by the smoke. End quote. The night that followed this momentous day he spent in dressing the wounds of the soldiers and administering such spiritual consolation as the suffering needed. Day after day he devoted himself wholly to the wounded and glided from cot to cot, cheering the wretched and pointing to those who felt that death was near, to the Savior of sinners. He notes in his diary that the excessive duties preyed upon his health, but expressed the belief that God will sustain him. He stood near the great elm tree when Washington drew his sword beneath it and took command of the Continental Army. This is important. I want to make note of this one again. He stood near the great elm tree when Washington drew his sword beneath it and took command of the Continental Army. Not long after, Dr. Franklin arrived to make an examination of the army by order of Congress, and Mr. Avery being introduced to him, a warm affection sprung between the two, which lasted till death. His zeal and patriotism made him a prominent man in the army, and Washington often invited him to dine at headquarters. He was frequently detailed at his own request to accompany expeditions into the adjacent country, for he courted toil and hardship in the cause which lay so near his heart. He stood in the ranks of Dorchester Heights the morning after they had been occupied, and when he saw the British ships heave their anchors and move down the bay, his exultation burst all bounds, and he exclaimed triumphantly, quote, "Give God the praise, for he hath done it." End quote. When the army took up its march for New York, he accompanied it, and saw with a breaking heart the defeat of the Americans at the Battle of Long Island. After it was over, he devoted all his time to the sick, caring for their wants and praying with them, and many a soul passed from earth on the prayers of this good man. He was besides Washington in his melancholy retreat through the Jerseys, and says, quote, "The luster of our commander's presence and the magnanimity gave a charm to our gloomy misfortunes. It animated and raised our spirits above the power of undue fear. The people of the country, however, were not so happily fortified against the shock of this sudden change of affairs, and sunk dejected." End quote. He accompanied him in his march on Trenton, breasted the snow and hail like a common soldier that wintry morning, and when the thunder of cannon and rattle of musketry awakened the sleeping Hessians, marched with him into the thickest of the fight. Feeling how fearful was the crisis that had come, he, after lifting an invocation to God, seized the musket of a soldier that fell by his side, and mounting a rum hogshead that stood in the street, the contents of which had helped to deepen the slumbers of the foe on Christmas Eve, fired away at the confused and hurrying masses of the enemy. In the darkness and tumult of the fight, he received a contusion on the right hip, which laid him up for several weeks, and he who had so long ministered to others was compelled to be ministered unto. On his recovery, he rejoined the army and shared with the soldiers the battles and marches that followed. He hunted with it at Valley Forge during all that terrible winter, in which the troops furnished an example of devotion to their general and love of country that has no parallel in history, nobly sustained the courage of the men, and showed a spirit of self-devotion that called forth the warmest commendations. Like Washington, he seemed superior to the weakness of common mortals, and exhibited the same serene courage, and wore the same calm aspect in that dark hour, which filled others with despondency, that he did when everything was promising and hopeful. He was while attached to the Northern army, and worked with his own hands in building those fortifications at Ticonderoga that afterwards fell before the advancing legions of Burgoyne. On his return, he was warmly received by Washington, who saw in him the embodiment of all those qualities he wished in a chaplain: intrepid and fearless in battle, unwearied in his attention to the sick and wounded, not only nursing them with care, but as faithful to their souls as though they were members of his own parish, with a love for his country so strong that it became a passion, cheerful under privation and ready for any hardship, never losing in the turmoil of the camp that warm and glowing piety which characterizes the devoted minister of God. He might well have a place near to his great chieftain's heart. During this period, we find him detached from Sherbourne's regiment and joined to that of Colonel Patterson. He knew Arnold well and was very active in the efforts made to capture him. He was by the side of Washington when he signed the death warrant of Andre and saw that ill-fated officer hung on the hill behind Paramount. In every battle he bore himself so nobly that his conduct elicited universal admiration, while his devotion to the wounded after it was overwon the hearts of both friends and foes. At the Battle of Bennington, like a good parson, Allen, he exposed himself to the hottest of fire, yet he refers to it only to say, quote, "The arm of the Lord protected me through the dangers seen and unseen." End quote. For his services in and after this bloody engagement, he received a vote of thanks from the governor and council of the state. After the war was over, we find him quietly settled in Bennington, gladly exchanging the turmoil of the camp and horrors of war for the more congenial pursuits of a pastor. Thus, having nobly helped to wrest the land from the hand of tyranny, he sat down under the tree of liberty, and faithful in his parish as he had been in the field, passed peacefully onto a tranquil death and the reward of a true patriot and faithful minister of Christ. Wow, kids, other listeners, that takes my breath away. That's one to read over and over and over. Also continues to bring tears and emotion to me in that very few pastors in the pulpit today could ever even light a candle to these men, and this one in particular. So with that, I have to rest, and we will go to the next chapter. I have to quiet my emotions after reading this, and in a while, we'll come back and we will read chapter 30, is Israel Evans. And with that, I ask you all to go back and either listen to these two chapters again or read them for yourselves, because the link is there, and I included for you kids the PDF into the little thumb drive that I've given you. So quiet your spirits and understand and be strong and fight for liberty and stand against tyranny, because tyranny is that which is against